issues. Like I said, my webcam on my desktop computer, for whatever reason, is not working. So I'm having to use two different devices. So just to be clear here, what we're looking at is this is the overview of what you have. And a lot of this is going to be similar depending on, or it's going to be consistent with like science and social studies. Obviously, if you're going for the academic honors diploma, you're going to notice that you're going to need 4 years of math. That's a big thing that jumps out as a main difference. And then the foreign language credits are going to be big on here as well. Okay, Ailuan?
Okay, for the 4 years of math, do math classes that you take this year, like maybe geometry or algebra 2 or algebra, do those count towards the 4 credits?
If you're taking a high school level math class now, it does, but you're still going to be required. Well, here's the thing. You're still going to be required to take 4 years of math. That's my understanding. And so what happens, and somebody else had asked this question, if you run out of math classes to take at North, you're going to have an opportunity to take classes outside of North, which would most likely be Indiana University. So to my knowledge, 4 years of high school math classes are still going to be required, or at the very least encouraged. That's something, then I tried to give some clarity about that to another person, but to my understanding, that is still the case. If that's something that's different, I will definitely make sure I ask Mr. Chafin about that. Sinead?
So I think I heard one of my sisters mention this, that if is econ technically a math class? So if I take like Calc BC junior year, if I take econ senior year, would that count as a math class?
I don't think economics is a math class. I think it's only defined as a social studies class. If there is some insinuating circumstance where you can take economics, it may be the macro or the microeconomics option that you have, which is an AP course. That would be something that I can ask about for Mr. Chafin, but that may also be something that once you get to high school, you're going to have to look at as like part of your 4-year plan. That's a good question. Ailuan?
Is it the same way with foreign language? Like, can you take, per se, if you ran out of French or Spanish classes, could you take more at IU?
It's possible, yeah. I think if the specific section on the course pages do not give you clarity, that's something I can ask as well. Obviously, I know that there are students in our building that are going to be affected by that, where they're essentially going to run out of classes to take. So I'm going to ask about that. That's on my list. I have a list. I have this Google Doc up here where I'm adding questions that I'm receiving. So hopefully we may be in a situation where I can have you ask those questions in person on Friday, not in person, but streaming via, like, we'll do like through our Teams meeting. I just don't know what Mr. Chafin's schedule is going to be for here in the building. I do know for a fact that you will be scheduling with me your actual classes on February 3rd. And I have put on the calendar I have put those dates on there. So February 3rd, I did put this on the calendar for you all to know that your schedule submissions will be on that date. And that will be done through Skyward, and I'm going to give you step-by-step instructions on how to do that. So that's a process that will be consistent, because they want to make sure that they get that submitted as easily as possible and as many students as they can on that date. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and segue out of the conversation about scheduling. Not to say that it's not important, obviously, but we did devote a full week last week to it for the most part. And I'm obviously going to be fielding more questions about it. But your goal is to make sure that that document that I sent out to you that has the boxes and has that information about what's available for you as a 9th grader, that you're starting to fill that out, and then you have that finished to be able to use that information in the course codes when you're actually submitting your course via Skyward, because that's what you're going to be using. You're going to be using the codes that are at the very beginning of the description. Cassidy?
When is it due?
February 3rd is, I'm not going to be collecting them, but you're going to be submitting your schedules on February 3rd. So on that date, you will have to have your information submitted so that North can have that information. I've had some people ask me already today, what do I do if I have a change that I want to make to my schedule? Well, if you do want to change your schedule, that is something where you can contact Bloomington North after the fact, and then they can definitely have that conversation with you so that you can that communication. It happens. You may decide over the summer that an elective you want to take is something you don't want to do it. So that's something that's definitely in the works that we can talk about. So, all right. What I want to do today is I want to talk about a little bit more with the War of 1812. We kind of have had a segue away from that. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about just some of the themes that lead to the war and then in the aftermath of the war. And this is something that is important because when we talk about this war, I'm just going to show you this battle map. We you know, the War of 1812 is often defined as the second war for independence because we are pitted against the British without any kind of major ally on our part, nor with Britain. So a lot of people argued that up until this point in American history, we were not fully considered a sovereign nation, meaning that the United States still had an unofficial attachment to Britain, that we were a British colony. We still had people living in the country that were probably British loyalists. I would say that's definitely possible. And what ends up happening is with the way that we are treated at sea by way of impressment, where our ships were sent to Europe to trade, and by way of our goods being seized, and also with the French, we know that as well. The French and the British are both having these, taking this action against us. One of the things that is important to know is that we could have very well gotten involved in a war with either country years earlier. But we know that the policies of Washington and Adams and Jefferson was neutrality. Whether that was because of the concern over finances for a war or the fact that we just didn't have a military built up, we didn't go into that conflict, and we tried to stay out of it. But by the time that James Madison takes the presidency, he's elected in 1808, there's tension rising right away almost, and it's building on what's already existed. But the thing that's important here to understand is that there's two factors at play here. You have what's going on at sea, and I'm just going to put my X out there because that's my reference to the sea, obviously because the map here. But we have impressment, where we have about 5,000 Americans in a 10-year span that are kidnapped by the British. That's a significant number that can't be overlooked. But the other thing that we need to understand is that the United States had interest in expanding west, but also expanding north. I honestly don't understand the infatuation with Canada. I have nothing against Canada, but I don't know what the infatuation was by the US specifically to go to Canada. Obviously expanding territory, but it's not as if you can farm the same ways in the southern part of the United States, in Canada. It's not feasibly possible to grow tobacco or cotton. So with that said, we do know that if you were living in this frontier region, for the most part, you were having to deal with, I'm talking about white settlers, dealing with ongoing tension with Native Americans. And that ongoing tension was brought about by the fact that we had numerous circumstances of Native Americans, having conflict with settlers, and those Native Americans were receiving weapons by way of the British, okay? British Canada was supplying weapons to the frontier region to resist settlement. And that caused a lot of people that were representatives of Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee, and even the Indiana Territory, to be very concerned and vetting those concerns to the United States government. And so a lot of these Western and Southern members of Congress who would be referred to as war hawks, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, they were the ones that were pushing Madison and the Democratic Republican Party to support war for Britain. Because if you read a lot of the primary sources from that time period by members of Congress for why they supported the war, one of the things they bring up is defending her honor, her meaning the United States, okay? In other words, the fact that the integrity of the United States, the honor of the United States was being threatened. And if we didn't stand up to do something about it, we were going to continuously be pushed around by European countries that didn't see us eye to eye, didn't see us as equals, okay? And so that in a large sense is the reason why this happens is that a lot of people would argue that American pride was on the line, okay? That, and it's no surprise that when the war's over and we basically have a stalemate, both sides agree to end the war with nothing being exchanged, when we have a late battle in New Orleans, which propels Andrew Jackson to this prominent role of a hero, it's no surprise that Americans feel very joyous and happy and jubilant about the fact that we won a battle that significant in the War of 1812. And so American patriotism is on the rise, even though there's no indication that the U.S. actually was victorious, because if you read the Treaty of Ghent, which ends the war, it's basically, yeah, we're going to go back to the way things were. Britain's going to stop impressing sailors. And from that point forward, we're going to have a great relationship with the British. So I want to show you something. I'm hoping this is going to work. There is a great video clip I love to show every year that is from CBS Sunday Morning that discusses the lasting impact that we can see in the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. and the White House from the time that the British had occupied Washington, D.C. and burned the Capitol. It's one of my favorite clips to show because we still have that evidence today, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through here, but I'm hoping this will work because I'm not sure because I'm on my laptop. So we will try here. Let's see here. All right. Here goes nothing.
200 years ago this month, 4,000 British soldiers lay siege to Washington, D.C. and set fire to the U.S. Capitol and the White House. And the burn marks on the White House walls are still there.
We now have evidence of the char marks, the scorching that would have happened when flames were drawn out through open windows and doors and licked up around the tops of the stone.
Jeez.
William Allman is the White House curator.
Is this the best evidence of the one time enemy forces were in our nation's capital?
As far as I know.
So I want to mention two things there. One, I had no idea that that had existed and was still evident until a couple of years ago. The video is from 2015, but the other evidence that we do have is when they were doing a heavy restoration of the White House in the late 40s, and it essentially had not been restored much at all since it was rebuilt after the burning. It was in disarray. There was mold on the wall. There was paint chipping everywhere. They found several charred pieces of wood behind walls when Harry Truman's administration had decided to do major renovations. So that's another piece of evidence that we do have that there was this event that took place.
The burning of Washington was the darkest moment for the United States and President James Madison in the War of 1812, a sort of second war of American independence. The British had been interfering with American trade at sea and kidnapping sailors. American efforts to expand westward and north into Canada were being thwarted by the British. 2 years into the war, with the Americans in retreat, British forces reached the nation's capital.
What was Washington like in 1814?
Miserable. Tiny, small, strung out.
William Allen is historian emeritus for the architect of the Capitol.
It was a construction site.
It was a construction site, and there were stone yards and brick yards and kilns, and it was just a mishmash.
The Capitol dome hadn't yet been built, but the original House chamber, located on the site of today's Statuary Hall, was an architectural masterpiece, recreated in these digital images.
Many people described it as the most beautiful room in America. It had this glorious ceiling with the 100 skylights.
Was it a fireproof room?
The room was fireproof except for the ceiling, and that, of course, was the Achilles heel of the room. The ceiling was wooden, and all they had to do, of course, is to catch the ceiling on fire. When it fell down, the rest of the room would be destroyed. The heat was intense. The glass in the skylights melted, became molten, and fell down in large chunks.
The Capitol's stone walls survived, as well as the Senate vestibule, with its distinctive corncob columns.
And what is the significance of the corncobs?
Well, the significance is the American plant in a classical way, sort of thinking the way classical architects would have thought, using this very important staple of the American diet and the American economy.
And fighting with the British that night were former American slaves.
You know, the British brilliantly exposed a real weak side in American society, and that was slavery and our dependence on slaves. And
historian Steve Vogel is author of a blow-by-blow account of Washington's capture.
And they offered freedom to slaves in this region, the Chesapeake. Said, you know, come over to our side. You know, we promise you freedom, and if you want to, by the way, you can fight against your former masters.
So it's important to know, I want to pause here for a moment, that Britain had already outlawed slavery in 1807. And the British dependency, even in their colonial areas on slavery, was not nearly as much as it was in the United States. And it's interesting to note because what the British did in the War of 1812 was essentially the same thing they did during the American Revolution, in which they offered emancipation to enslaved African Americans if they joined the British during the war. So there were several thousand that did go on the British side during the war. Now, granted, unless they left with Britain to go back to, you know, went back with to Britain, there's no evidence of emancipation, obviously, because the war was not won by the British. It was a stalemate. But I think it's interesting that it was a similar strategy that we saw during the American Revolution as we did in the War of 1812, where the British were really targeting what they knew was an essential part of the American economy.
From the Capitol, British Navy Rear Admiral George Cockburn, Army Major General Robert Ross, and 150 redcoats marched to the White House.
So the British came right through.
CD, do you have a question?
Okay, well, it's kind of related to this. I was just going to say that I heard a podcast about, like, it was like talking about the two times when the same thing, sort of like the same thing that happened on January 6th. And no, I hadn't actually heard about it. And it was in 1954 when 4 Puerto Rican like protesters went into Congress and had guns and were shooting for their movement. And I hadn't actually heard about that, and I was wondering why we haven't talked about that.
That's a good question. I was not fully aware of that as well, but if that's, I would like to do some research on that, and we can definitely talk about it. So thank you for letting me know, and I want to make a note, and I will definitely do some more information on that so we can talk about it.
Here,
Right through here. Not these steps, but this wall, this door.
again, White House curator Bill Allman.
And they walked in, and what do you think their first impression was?
I think that it was a pretty good sized house, but not a palatial one.
Right. No Buckingham Palace.
No Buckingham Palace, no Versailles. That it was, you know, reasonably well decorated.
The biggest surprise? A dinner set for 40. So the British feasted in the White House dining room before burning the mansion down. Here, too, the walls survived, but little remains of what was once inside. What does is an American icon.
This is the East Room, the largest room in the house.
This is the room where Teddy Roosevelt's kids used to roller skate, right?
Yes, on a floor that looks much like this one.
And this is the room where Susan Ford had her senior prom, right?
That's right.
So, more importantly, this is the room with
This is the great full-length portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart. And this is the one that Dolly Madison rather famously saved. She had already packed up state papers, red velvet drapes that she had put in the Oval Room. So then, kind of as a last-minute thing, she says, oh, we've got to save General Washington. And she gave the instructions to get it off the wall, and it was bolted on.
Hard to get off.
So they had to pretty much cut the frame open and then, lift the canvas out on its stretcher.
And who did that?
Servants, the maitre d' and one of the family's slaves.
Well, she was also busy cramming silverware into her purse, right?
Yep. She was trying to save everything she could. She was leaving her personal things.
As a rule, the British invaders didn't loot, but one soldier grabbed this.
And this is believed to be Madison's personal little traveling medicine chest that was taken from the White House by one of the British troops, later passed to a member of one of the naval forces, and then descended in his family until it was given to Franklin Roosevelt in 1939.
Given back.
Given back.
And we're whispering right now because the current president is being interviewed right under us.
Correct.
Okay.
After torching the White House, the British burned the buildings housing the Departments of State, Treasury, and War, concluding one of the most devastating days in American history.
I mean, can you imagine the scene after the British have departed Washington? The Capitol and the White House are smoldering shells. The American army has abandoned the city. Nobody knows where President Madison or the cabinet are. It's really impossible to think of many more despondent, desperate moments in American history.
A Union Jack flew over the Capitol.
It did. A lot of people felt that, the young republic was coming to its end, that the American experiment was dying in its infancy.
Fearing
it would have been interesting what would have happened if the war had been won or had been lost, by the U.S., because you had several people that were already concerned about, the fact that in their minds the war was not going to be won. They were concerned about still the infancy of the country. You're only in the fourth presidency here, and a loss would have completely dismantled everything. Last thing I want to show you real quick before we depart is I just want to show you the impact that we see with these elections. I have 4 that I'm going to lay over, but we're just going to look at the first 2. And I just want to remind you again about the significance of what these elections do. We know that Madison gets elected for the first time in 1808, and we still see kind of a stronghold of the the Federalist Party here in New England because of the embargo that Jefferson had placed on trade a year before, which crippled the economy of the New England region because they couldn't trade freely. And that is where you kind of see a resurgence of the Federalist Party under Charles Pinckney. The reason why you see 6 electoral votes for DeWitt Clinton in 1808 is because he, as a native of the state of New York, received 6 electoral votes because some people had in New York, which a lot of times was that dividing line between the North and the South to some extent, did not have faith in James Madison. But I want to show you what happens with 1812. And this is DeWitt Clinton again. That may have been George Clinton, in 1808. But in 1812, you see DeWitt Clinton and the Federalist Party expanding even more so. Now, this election was after the war had started, but you could see why this war was very much divisive by geography. Now, the New England region largely votes against the war because they can't trade with their most important trade partner, Britain. But this is going to come back to be devastating for this region, because what happens is in the same year that the Battle of New Orleans is victorious for the United States, there's a group of representatives from the states of New England that meet in Connecticut and Hartford and have what's called the Hartford Convention. And one of the things that they discuss is secession, even going as far as to considering secession from the United States in order to have more control over their fate and their economy. And this becomes devastating because when the war is over and we're very happy and patriotic as a country for going toe-to-toe with Britain, there has to be someone that we have to blame for it. And if you look at 1816, look what happens to the Federalist Party. This is it. This is the last time that we're going to see them be a viable party in any election. All right, I'm going to stop for that time because we're just about out of time, and we are going to talk more about this later on. But if you do have any questions concerning scheduling, please relay those to me before Friday, and I will see you back here tomorrow at 12 o'clock. Thank you.